Adjust your posture. Maybe dim the lights if you're watching this late, or turn on a fan if the room feels warm. This is not the kind of history that demands your alert attention. This is the kind of history that rewards the opposite: a slightly tired mind, a curious but relaxed spirit. The kind of late-night headspace where you stop scrolling and just listen. And if you find yourself enjoying this, consider subscribing. But only if you genuinely enjoy stories about human ambition colliding with physics, about magnificent failures that somehow become more valuable than any success, about civilizations that spent fortunes on beautiful things that immediately went wrong and then stayed wrong for 800 years. Because that is exactly where we are going tonight. We are traveling to Pisa, Italy, to a field that should have been unremarkable, to a tower that was supposed to stand straight, proud, and perfectly vertical. A tower that instead looks like it changed its mind halfway through construction and decided to lean slightly toward the Mediterranean, almost politely, almost as if it is bowing to something only it can see. And here is the strange thing. The thing that keeps historians, engineers, and tourists equally fascinated. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is not famous despite its flaw. It is famous because of its flaw. The mistake did not ruin the tower. The mistake made the tower immortal. But to understand how that happened, we have to go back to a time when Pisa was not a tourist destination with tired gift shops and overpriced gelato. We have to go back to when Pisa was an empire. The 12th century along the western coast of Italy was not a quiet time. The Mediterranean Sea functioned less like a body of water and more like a highway crowded with aggressive drivers. Maritime republics like Venice, Genoa, and Amalfi were constantly competing for trade routes, naval dominance, and the kind of wealth that makes civilizations decide to build monuments that scream, "Look at us." Pisa was right there in that conversation. Wealthy, ambitious, absolutely convinced of its own destiny. Pisan ships controlled significant chunks of Mediterranean trade. Pisan merchants brought back spices, silks, treasures, and ideas from North Africa, the Levant, and Byzantium. Pisan soldiers participated in the Crusades and returned with stories, relics, and a deeply inflated sense of cultural importance. And when a wealthy maritime republic feels important, it does what all wealthy civilizations have always done. It builds something beautiful and completely unnecessary. Something that serves no practical purpose except to remind everyone who walks past it that this city is not messing around. The plan was magnificent. The Piazza dei Miracoli, the Square of Miracles, a cathedral, a baptistery, a cemetery, and a freestanding campanile. A bell tower, nothing more than a vertical exclamation point attached to an already impressive cathedral complex. The cathedral itself was stunning. White marble, intricate columns, multiple levels of loggias, Byzantine influence mixed with Romanesque solidity. It was the kind of building that made neighboring cities quietly jealous. So the bell tower needed to match. It needed to rise high, command attention, and broadcast peace and prosperity to anyone arriving by sea or land. Construction began in August of 1173. The ground was blessed. The foundation was laid. The first stones were placed with the kind of optimism that only ignorant builders possess, and the ground, quietly, had other plans. Here is what the medieval engineers did not know, could not have known, and arguably should have noticed before they started digging. The soil beneath Pisa is not like normal soil. It is not the kind of dense, compact, cooperative earth that happily supports heavy stone towers. The ground there is a complicated mess of soft clay, fine sand, and layers of silt deposited over thousands of years by the nearby Arno River. The water table is absurdly high. The entire foundation sits on what geologists politely call unstable alluvial deposits, and what anyone else would call glorified mud. Building a heavy stone tower on that ground is like balancing a grand piano on warm cheese. Physics does not care about architectural ambition. Physics cares about weight distribution, compression forces, and whether the ground beneath your foundation is going to slowly squish sideways like a tired mattress. The engineers began construction. They built the first 3 floors without noticing anything unusual. The tower rose. The marble gleamed. The columns took shape. Everything looked perfectly fine from the outside. But beneath the surface, something was already moving. The southern side of the foundation was sinking. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly at first. A few centimeters over the first year. Then a few more. The soil on the south side was slightly softer. The weight of the stone was slightly heavier on that edge, and gravity, as it always does, took the path of least resistance. By the time the 3rd floor was complete, the tower was already leaning. Not dramatically. Not the kind of lean that makes pedestrians gasp and point, but a lean, a measurable, undeniable tilt toward the southeast. The builders stopped. They looked at their work. They looked at the foundation. They probably had a conversation that involved a lot of shouting and hand gestures and the kind of frustration unique to people who realize they have made an extremely expensive mistake. And then they did something that perfectly captures how humans have always handled structural problems. They decided to keep going anyway. Medieval project management was not especially sophisticated. There were no independent safety inspectors, no geological survey requirements, no building codes enforced by nervous governments. When a construction project encountered a problem, the solution was usually more construction. Just keep stacking stones. Maybe it will stabilize. Maybe it will correct itself. Maybe God, who presumably wanted this tower to exist, would intervene on behalf of verticality. So they continued building, and as they added more floors, the lean increased. The tower began to settle deeper into its unfortunate posture. The southern columns compressed. The northern columns stretched. The marble started showing hairline cracks that engineers today would call catastrophic warning signs, and medieval builders probably just called Tuesday. Then something happened that seemed like a disaster, but turned out to be the tower's first accidental savior. War broke out. Specifically, the Republic of Pisa found itself locked in a prolonged, exhausting, resource-draining conflict with Genoa, Florence, and Lucca. The Battle of Meloria in 1284 was particularly devastating. Pisa lost most of its naval fleet. The economy stumbled. The city's attention shifted from architectural grandeur to basic survival. Construction on the tower stopped. For nearly a century, the half-finished campanile stood there, leaning, waiting, probably confusing anyone who walked past it. And here is the irony that makes historians smile. That pause saved the tower. When construction stopped, the ground had time to settle. The soft clay compressed slowly beneath the existing weight. The foundation found something resembling equilibrium. Not stable equilibrium in the engineering sense. Not the kind of safety that would make a modern structural engineer sleep well. But enough equilibrium that the tower did not collapse. The soil adjusted. The lean stabilized at about 1 degree, and the unfinished tower waited. War, it turns out, was exactly what this building needed. Human conflict, with all its violence and chaos, accidentally provided the one thing that no architect could have supplied: patience. Time for physics to finish its work. When construction resumed in 1272, the builders faced a fascinating problem. The tower was already leaning. Everyone knew it was leaning. The local population probably made jokes about it, but the city still wanted a bell tower. The cathedral complex still needed its vertical exclamation point. So the engineers did something both brilliant and absurd. They tried to correct the lean by building the upper floors slightly taller on the sinking side. If the tower leans south, they reasoned, make the southern columns taller. Build the upper floors at a slight angle. Compensate for the tilt by tilting the architecture in the opposite direction. This is the architectural equivalent of a nobleman with food stuck in his beard, pretending nobody notices. It is human denial made physical. It is medieval gaslighting in stone. They built the fourth floor with taller columns on the southern edge, then the fifth floor, then the sixth. Each level attempted to pull the tower's center of gravity back toward the center. The result was a tower that leaned one way, but had floors that leaned another way. Walking up the internal staircase became a mildly disorienting experience. Your body felt the tilt while your eyes saw corrected geometry. The tower was simultaneously crooked and trying very hard to look straight, and the ground, predictably, did not care about these efforts. The foundation kept sinking. The lean kept increasing. By the time the seventh floor and the bell chamber were finally completed in 1372, nearly 200 years after construction began, the tower leaned at about 1.6 degrees. The top was displaced nearly 4 meters from where it should have been. The builders gave up on fixing it. They finished the structure, hung the bells, and essentially shrugged. The Leaning Tower was complete. It was wrong. It was beautiful. It was crooked in a way that could never be uncrooked. And Pisa, perhaps exhausted by centuries of war and construction and geological betrayal, simply accepted it. For the next 400 years, the Leaning Tower of Pisa did exactly what it was designed to do. It held bells. It called monks to prayer. It marked the hours for a city that had largely stopped worrying about its tilt. The tower became part of the landscape. Visitors noticed it, travelers wrote about it, but nobody panicked. The building had been leaning for generations. If it was going to collapse, surely it would have collapsed already. That logic, by the way, is terrifying to structural engineers. The assumption that a building is safe because it has not fallen yet is roughly equivalent to assuming a person is healthy because they have not died yet. Buildings accumulate damage. Foundations shift incrementally. Materials degrade slowly. The fact that something has stood for centuries does not guarantee it will stand for one more hour. But humans have always been remarkably good at ignoring slow-motion disasters. And the tower, for all its visual drama, moved at a glacial pace. The average tourist in the 1500s would have noticed nothing. The average resident of Pisa probably forgot the tower was leaning until someone pointed it out. This is how history works. Most of it is just people getting used to things that should terrify them. Then, in the late 16th century, someone showed up who could not ignore the tower. Someone whose name would become permanently attached to Pisa's most famous mistake. Someone who may or may not have done something that changed physics forever. Galileo Galilei, young mathematician. Brilliant, argumentative, obsessed with how things move through space, and according to legend, thoroughly bored during a visit to the cathedral one afternoon. The story is so perfect that historians desperately want it to be true, even though most evidence suggests it probably did not happen exactly the way everyone remembers. But the story matters more than the facts here. The story is what made the tower famous beyond Italy. The story turned a crooked campanile into a global symbol of scientific revolution. According to Galileo's own later writings, He performed experiments from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He dropped objects of different weights simultaneously and observed that they landed at the same time. This contradicted Aristotle, who had claimed for nearly 2,000 years that heavier objects fall faster. Gravity, Galileo allegedly demonstrated, does not care about weight. It accelerates everything at the same rate. Whether Galileo actually dropped balls from the tower is genuinely uncertain. He never mentioned the experiment in his published works. The story came from his students and biographers, who may have embellished. But something about the image is irresistible. A young scientist standing on a crooked tower, dropping weights past leaning marble columns, watching the stones of Aristotle fall apart in real time. The tower that could not stand straight, helping to prove that the universe operates by rules, not by tradition. The mistake becoming the stage for one of history's most important intellectual rebellions. And here is the deeper irony. Galileo's work on gravity and motion eventually led to our modern understanding of structural mechanics. The same physics that explains falling objects also explains sinking foundations. The tower that helped inspire modern engineering was itself an engineering failure. The student surpassed the teacher. The building that could not follow the rules helped reveal the rules. The tower had become something more than a bell tower. It had become a character, a symbol, a living argument that imperfection can be useful. But symbols do not pay for maintenance. And by the 19th century, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was in genuine trouble. The centuries of accumulated tilt had reached about 5 degrees. The foundation was sinking faster than ever, partly because groundwater extraction had lowered the water table, and partly because time does not stop being destructive just because a building is famous. The tower leaned so much that the southern edge of the foundation was sinking into ground that had been compacted and recomputed and stressed beyond anything reasonable. Cracks appeared in the marble. The columns on the lower levels began to show visible deformation. The interior staircase, already disorienting, became genuinely uncomfortable to climb. Visitors reported feeling like they were walking uphill in a building that was simultaneously falling over. Engineers started sounding alarms. Not just local Italian engineers worried about a beloved monument. International engineers who understood soil mechanics and structural fatigue. They ran calculations. They built models. They projected future tilt based on historical rates of movement. The numbers were not reassuring. If the tower continued leaning at its current rate, it would reach critical instability sometime in the early 21st century. Not distant future, not abstract geological time. Soon, within the lifetimes of people already alive. Something had to be done. But here is the problem that defines the entire modern history of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. How do you save a building whose primary identity is its flaw? If you straighten the tower completely, you destroy what makes it famous. If you do nothing, it eventually collapses. If you intervene badly, you could make everything worse. Humanity, as usual, decided to try everything. The first major intervention came in 1838. An architect named Alessandro Gherardesca had an idea that seemed sensible. Dig a walkway around the base of the tower, expose the foundation columns. Let visitors see the base that had been buried for centuries. It would be educational. It would be beautiful. It would also be catastrophic. When Gherardesca dug the walkway, he removed soil from the northern side of the foundation, soil that had been acting as a counterweight, soil that was quietly helping keep the tower from leaning further toward the south. Removing that soil changed the pressure dynamics completely. Water from the high water table rushed into the exposed area. The southern foundation sank faster. The tower leaned an additional several centimeters almost immediately. They tried to fix a problem and made it worse. This pattern will repeat. In 1934, Benito Mussolini decided that the Leaning Tower of Pisa was an embarrassment to Italian masculinity and fascist ideals of order. The tower leaned. It was crooked. It looked weak. Mussolini, who was many terrible things but never a patient man, ordered engineers to straighten it immediately. Their solution was brutal. Drill holes into the foundation. Inject massive amounts of mortar grout directly into the soil. The idea was to solidify the soft ground, create a stable base, and stop the sinking. It made sense on paper. It failed spectacularly in reality. The grout injections displaced the soil unevenly. The tower lurched. The tilt increased dramatically, reaching 5.5 degrees, the steepest angle in the tower's history. Mussolini's intervention had made the building more crooked than it had ever been. The dictator who demanded perfection achieved the opposite. The tower, as if mocking him, leaned harder. And then World War II arrived. Allied forces advancing through Italy were given coordinates for artillery strikes. Pisa contained strategic bridges, railroad junctions, and German defensive positions. The Leaning Tower of Pisa appeared on targeting maps. A group of American soldiers looked at the tower, looked at their orders, and made a decision that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with something more human. They refused to fire. They could not bring themselves to destroy something that beautiful, even if it stood crooked, even if the Germans might be using it as an observation post. The tower survived the war because someone looked at it and felt something that defied military logic. The mistake had officially become immortal, but the real crisis was still coming. In 1989, a tragedy in another Italian city changed everything for Pisa. The civic tower of Pavia, a medieval structure built 1,000 years earlier, collapsed without warning. Nearly 50 people were killed. The tower simply gave up. Centuries of standing, seconds of falling, stone and dust where a building used to be. Engineers across Italy panicked. If Pavia could collapse, any medieval tower could collapse, including, perhaps especially, the one in Pisa that had been leaning for 8 centuries. The Italian government convened an emergency commission. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was closed to the public in 1990. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the bells fell silent. The situation was genuinely dire. The tower's lean had reached 5.5 degrees, the maximum recorded angle from the fascist grout disaster. The southern foundation was compressing at an accelerating rate. Computer models suggested that without intervention, the tower would topple between 2030 and 2040. Not maybe, not possibly, almost certainly. Engineers from around the world submitted proposals. Some were brilliant, some were insane. One involved freezing the entire foundation with liquid nitrogen. Another suggested demolishing the tower and rebuilding it straight, which entirely missed the point. The commission rejected dozens of plans before settling on something subtle, patient, and almost boringly effective. They decided to remove soil from the northern side, but not quickly, not brutally, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, using specialized drills that extracted tiny amounts of earth from beneath the raised side of the foundation. The idea was simple. If the southern side is sinking, make the northern side sink too. Lower the entire foundation evenly. Let the tower settle back toward vertical without straightening it completely. This is the engineering equivalent of fixing a crooked picture frame by lowering the higher side instead of raising the lower side. It is counterintuitive. It requires extreme patience. It worked. Over a decade of careful extraction, the tower straightened by about half a degree, not enough to lose its famous lean, just enough to stop the disaster. The final angle settled at 397 degrees, still leaning, still crooked, still the architectural equivalent of a mildly drunk nobleman, but stable. For the first time in its existence, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was not actively falling over. The project cost about $40 million. It took 11 years. It involved hundreds of engineers, geologists, and historians, arguing constantly about every single decision. And when the tower reopened to the public in 2001, the people of Pisa threw a celebration that lasted for days. They had saved a mistake. They had preserved a failure. They had spent $40 million keeping something imperfect exactly as imperfect as it needed to be. And here is where the story becomes something larger than architecture. The Leaning Tower of Pisa survived because of a series of beautiful accidents. War stopped construction long enough for the soil to settle. Bad engineering corrections made the lean more dramatic and therefore more famous. A dictator's ego made the tower lean harder. An artillery crew refused to shoot. A different tower's collapse triggered a rescue that should have happened centuries earlier. None of this was planned. None of it was strategic. The tower did not survive because humans are brilliant. It survived because humans are stubborn, chaotic, occasionally kind, and frequently lucky. We built something wrong. We kept building it wrong. We tried to fix it and made it worse. We tried again and made it slightly better. And somewhere in that long, embarrassing, magnificent process, we fell in love with the thing we could not fix. Perfection, it turns out, is forgettable. You walk past a straight tower and you do not remember it. You walk past a tower that looks like it is bowing to the earth and you stop. You take a photograph. You tell your friends. You feel something. The flaw makes it human. The flaw makes it yours. There is a psychological truth here that applies to more than buildings. Humans do not bond with perfection. Perfection is cold. Perfect things have no stories. Perfect things did not survive war and bad soil and Mussolini's grout injections. Perfect things were never almost destroyed by people trying to help. We love the Leaning Tower of Pisa because it should have fallen 100 times, and it is still standing. Because it is vulnerable and crooked and absolutely defiant. Because it looks at gravity every single day and says, "Not today." We see ourselves in it. Our own leaning, our own visible flaws, our own survival against odds that made no sense. The tower is not famous despite being broken. It is famous because it is broken and still here. So the next time you see that image, that white marble cylinder tilting against a Tuscan sky, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at 8 centuries of human ambition colliding with physics and refusing to admit defeat. You are looking at a building that wars saved, that dictators made worse, that engineers kept alive through equal parts brilliance and luck. You are looking at the most beautiful mistake ever constructed. The Leaning Tower of Pisa will probably outlive us all. Not because it is strong, because it is weak in exactly the right way. Because the ground beneath it finally settled into something resembling acceptance. Because generations of humans decided that this crooked, absurd, impossible thing was worth saving even when saving it made no practical sense. And that, more than any engineering achievement, is what makes the tower immortal. Not the stone, not the marble, not the bells. The decision, repeated across centuries, to protect something imperfect because its imperfection tells a better story than any straight line ever could. The mistake did not ruin the tower. The mistake made the tower. And somewhere, In the quiet, late-night hours when the tourists have gone home and the bells are silent, and the Mediterranean stars reflect off white marble that should have fallen, the Leaning Tower of Pisa continues leaning. Almost politely, almost apologetically, almost defiantly. Gravity, for now, has agreed to wait. If you enjoyed wandering through history like this, if the idea of settling in for more stories about magnificent failures and accidental survival appeals to something in you, consider subscribing. There are more buildings that should have collapsed, more civilizations that succeeded despite themselves, more moments when humanity looked at a disaster and somehow found something beautiful hiding inside it. And the sun, as always, will be there tomorrow, indifferent, eternal, watching as we keep building things that lean. But that is a story for another late night. For now, sleep well, or stay curious, or both. The Leaning Tower will still be there whenever you return. For now, gravity has agreed to wait. But gravity, like all patient forces, was never truly asleep. It was simply biding its time, watching, calculating, letting the engineers feel proud of themselves for a little while. Because here is the thing about the Leaning Tower of Pisa that the tourist brochures do not emphasize. The tower is not fixed. It was never fixed. It was only stabilized. And stabilization, in the language of structural engineering, is a polite way of saying we have postponed the inevitable by a few more generations. The soil beneath Pisa has not changed its personality. It is still clay, still sand, still silt deposited by a river that has been flooding this plain for millennia. The water table still rises and falls with the seasons, with the rainfall, with the agricultural demands of the farms that surround the city. Every time a farmer pumps groundwater to irrigate olive trees or grapevines, the earth beneath the tower shifts slightly. Not much, not enough to measure in a single season, but enough to matter over decades. The engineers who performed the Great Rescue in the 1990s knew this. They installed an elaborate monitoring system beneath the tower. Sensors that measure tilt down to 1/100th of a millimeter. Inclinometers buried in the foundation stone. GPS receivers on every level, constantly triangulating the tower's position against fixed points in the surrounding landscape. The tower is probably the most measured building on Earth. There are people in white lab coats checking its posture every single morning. And every single morning, the data shows something that keeps those engineers from sleeping too soundly. The tower still moves. It breathes with the sun. On warm days, the stone expands on the southern face, and the tower leans slightly away from the heat. On cold nights, it contracts and tilts back. When heavy rain saturates the clay, the foundation sinks a fraction of a millimeter. When summer droughts dry the soil, it rises again. The tower is not a static monument. It is a living argument between stone and earth, and the argument never ends. This is not what most people want to hear about a beloved landmark. They want to hear that the problem is solved, that the tower is safe, that they can climb its crooked staircase without thinking about mortality. But the truth is more interesting than safety. The truth is that the Leaning Tower of Pisa exists in a state of permanent negotiation with destruction, and somehow, absurdly, it keeps winning. The year 2013 brought a moment that should have been terrifying. A team of geologists from the University of Pisa published a study that made international headlines. Their research suggested that the tower's lean was increasing again, not dramatically, not at the catastrophic rates of the 1980s, but increasing. The soil, they argued, was slowly resuming its ancient work of sinking beneath the southern foundation. The interventions had bought time, but they had not bought forever. The engineering community reacted with the kind of polite academic panic that Italians have perfected over centuries of managing emergencies that refuse to arrive on schedule. Conferences were called, papers were written, computer models were run and rerun again. And after months of analysis, the consensus emerged. The geologists were not wrong, but they were also not entirely right. The tower was moving, yes, but it was moving within predictable parameters. The extraction of soil from the northern side in the 1990s had created a new equilibrium, not a permanent one. The tower would always move. The goal was never to stop the movement. The goal was to keep the movement slow enough that the stone did not crack and the foundation did not fail. This is the philosophical heart of the tower's modern existence. Humans cannot win against physics. They can only negotiate. They can only delay. They can only hope that future generations will be smarter or richer or luckier than the present one. Every engineer who has ever worked on the Leaning Tower of Pisa has understood, probably with some private existential dread, that they were not saving the tower forever. They were saving it for the next person. And the person after that. And the person after that. But something unexpected happened in the years following the Great Rescue. The tower became more popular than ever. Visitor numbers skyrocketed. People who had never cared about medieval architecture suddenly wanted to see this crooked thing before it fell, or before it was straightened, or before something changed. The fear of loss made the tower precious in a way it had never been before. This is a strange quirk of human psychology. We value things most when we believe they might disappear. The tower had leaned for 8 centuries, and for most of that time, the people of Pisa barely thought about it. It was just there, part of the background, like the river or the hills or the sound of bells marking the hours. But when the engineers announced that the tower might collapse within 50 years, suddenly everyone needed to see it. Suddenly, it became a bucket list destination. Suddenly, the crooked campanile was on every travel poster, every documentary, every list of places to visit before you die. The marketing departments of Tuscany did not miss this opportunity. They leaned into the lean, so to speak. Posters showed the tower at its most dramatic angle. Souvenir shops sold miniature replicas that tilted on little wooden bases. Postcards featured tourists posing as if they were holding the tower up, pushing it straight with their bare hands. The imagery was playful, almost absurd. But beneath the humor was something darker, the unspoken knowledge that this could be the last generation to see it. The people of Pisa, for their part, developed a complicated relationship with the tower's fame. On one hand, the tourists brought money. The souvenir shops brought jobs. The restaurants and hotels and gelaterias depended entirely on the steady stream of visitors who came to see the crooked building, and then stayed for the wine and the pasta and the sunset over the Arno. The tower was the city's economic engine. Without it, Pisa would be just another small Italian city with a nice cathedral and no particular reason to stop there on the way to Florence. On the other hand, the tower had become a joke, a caricature. People came to Pisa not to appreciate its history or its art or its 1,000 years of maritime glory. They came to take a photograph where it looked like they were holding up a building that was falling over. They spent 15 minutes at the tower, bought a cheap plastic replica, and left. The deep story, the 8th century story of war and geology and human stubbornness, was invisible to most visitors. They saw the lean, they laughed, they moved on, and yet. The tower did not seem to mind. It had been misunderstood for so long that misunderstanding had become its natural habitat. The medieval builders misunderstood the soil, The fascist engineers misunderstood the foundation. The tourists misunderstand the history. The tower just stood there, leaning, accepting everyone's projections with the patience of something that had already outlived every person who ever tried to fix it. Then came the earthquake. Not a single earthquake. Multiple earthquakes. A swarm of seismic activity that rolled through central Italy in 2016 and 2017, destroying entire towns, leveling medieval buildings that had stood for centuries, killing hundreds of people. The ground shook from Rome to Bologna. The ancient stones of Italy remembered every tremor, and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, impossibly, did nothing. It did not crack. It did not sway. It did not increase its lean. It simply stood there, crooked as ever, while the earth beneath it convulsed. Seismologists were baffled. Structural engineers were baffled. Everyone who understood the fragility of the tower's foundation expected the earthquakes to finish the job that gravity had been trying to do for 8 centuries. But the tower refused to cooperate. What happened, the scientists eventually discovered, was a miracle of physics disguised as luck. The very softness of the soil that had caused the lean in the first place also protected the tower from seismic shaking. The clay and sand and silt acted like a shock absorber. The tower did not vibrate violently during earthquakes because the ground beneath it was too mushy to transmit high-frequency waves. The same flaw that made the tower lean also made it earthquake-proof. Let that sit for a moment. The flaw protected the tower. The mistake was the shield. The thing that should have destroyed it instead saved it from destruction. This is not engineering. This is poetry. This is the universe writing irony with the subtlety of a falling piano. The medieval builders could not have known. They did not design the tower to be earthquake-resistant. They did not choose the soft soil for its seismic benefits. They simply built on bad ground because they did not know any better. And that bad ground turned out to be the perfect defense against the one threat no one had considered. The tower was saved by its original sin. The lean that came from the soft soil was the same lean that kept the tower standing when the earth shook. By 2018, the engineers felt confident enough to declare the tower stable for at least the next 300 years. 300 years. That is a number that sounds large until you remember that the tower has already stood for 800. 300 more years is just another chapter in a very long book. The engineers were essentially saying that they had bought enough time for future engineers to figure out the next intervention. They were passing the problem forward, like a torch that nobody wanted but nobody could extinguish. The announcement received international coverage. Headlines proclaimed that the Leaning Tower of Pisa was saved, that the crisis was over, that the monument would stand for centuries to come. The tourists returned in even greater numbers. The souvenir shops restocked their miniature replicas. The bells rang out over the Piazza dei Miracoli, marking the hours as they had for 800 years. But beneath the celebration, the monitoring continued. The sensors still recorded every millimeter of movement. The inclinometers still measured every fraction of a degree. The engineers still gathered for annual conferences to review the data and argue about what it meant. The tower was not saved. It was being saved. Continuously. Forever. The verb was present tense, and would remain present tense for as long as humans cared enough to keep showing up. And this is where the story becomes something that transcends architecture. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is not really about a tower. It is about attention. It is about the decision, made over and over again across generations, to keep paying attention to something that keeps threatening to break. The tower exists because people keep watching it, keep measuring it, Keep worrying about it. Keep loving it despite its flaws, or perhaps because of them. There is a philosophical argument hidden in those white marble columns. The tower is not a building, it is a relationship. An 8th century conversation between humans and gravity, between ambition and humility, between the desire for perfection and the acceptance of beautiful failure. Every generation that looks at the tower and decides to save it is participating in that conversation, adding their voice to a dialogue that began in 1173 and will continue for as long as there are people who care about crooked things that refuse to fall. But let us be honest about something that the official histories tend to soften. There is a version of this story where the tower collapses. Not tomorrow, not next year, but someday. The engineers say 300 years of stability, but engineers are human, and humans are bad at predicting the distant future. Climate change will affect the water table. Rising seas will push salt water into the groundwater, changing the chemistry of the clay. More frequent droughts will dry the soil unevenly. More intense rains will saturate it beyond historical norms. The tower has survived 8 centuries of weather, but the weather is changing in ways that the medieval builders could not have imagined, and modern engineers cannot fully model. There is also the problem of human attention. Will people care about the Leaning Tower of Pisa in 300 years? In 500? In 1,000? Civilizations rise and fall. Cities are abandoned. Monuments are forgotten. The tower has survived wars and earthquakes and fascist engineering, but has it survived indifference? Indifference is the slowest poison. A building that everyone ignores eventually crumbles because nobody notices the cracks widening. The tower's survival depends not just on physics, but on relevance, on people continuing to find meaning in its lean. And yet, something about this crooked tower seems to generate its own relevance. Every generation rediscovers it. Every generation invents new reasons to care. Galileo needed it for physics. Mussolini needed it for fascist optics. The engineers of the 1990s needed it for professional pride. The tourists need it for photographs. The people of Pisa need it for income. The tower is a mirror. Everyone who looks at it sees what they need to see. But perhaps the truest thing about the Leaning Tower of Pisa is the simplest. It leans. That is all. It has no deeper meaning, no hidden message, no secret purpose. It is a bell tower built on bad ground by people who should have known better. And that accidental fact, that pure, unplanned randomness, is what makes it a more honest monument than any perfectly straight cathedral or flawlessly balanced dome. The tower does not pretend to be something it is not. It does not hide its failure. It stands there, visibly, obviously, almost comically wrong, and dares you to look away. Most people do not look away. They stare. They take photographs. They climb the crooked staircase and feel the disorientation of a building that argues with itself. They stand at the top, looking out over the red roofs of Pisa, the Arno River curling toward the sea, the hills of Tuscany soft in the distance, and they feel something that has no name, something between vertigo and wonder, something between fear and gratitude. The tower has that effect on people. It always has. It always will. So here we are, at the end of a story that does not actually end. The Leaning Tower of Pisa will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and probably for the rest of your life, and for the lives of your children, and for the lives of their children. The engineers have bought that much time. What happens after that is not your problem. It is not my problem. It is the problem of people who do not exist yet, who will look at this crooked tower and decide whether it is worth saving one more time. And here is the strange comfort buried in that uncertainty. The tower has always been someone else's problem. In 1173, it was the problem of the builders who laid the foundation on bad soil. In 1272, it was the problem of the engineers who tried to correct the lean by building crooked floors. In 1934, it was the problem of the fascists who made everything worse. In 1990, it was the problem of the International Commission that closed the tower and argued for a decade about how to save it. Every generation inherits the problems of the generation before, and every generation, if it is lucky, passes those problems forward slightly less urgent than they found them. The tower is not a burden. It is a relay race. The baton is a crooked building that should have fallen 100 times, and the runners keep showing up. The sun sets over Pisa. The marble warms and cools. The sensors record their data. The engineers sleep uneasily. The tourists take their photographs. The bells ring. The earth shifts a fraction of a millimeter, and the Leaning Tower of Pisa continues doing what it has always done, leaning, waiting, outlasting everyone who ever tried to fix it. Gravity, for now, has agreed to wait. But gravity, as we have learned, is never truly patient. It is merely slow, and slow is not the same as kind. The tower knows this. The engineers know this. The people of Pisa know this in their bones. The way coastal populations know the sea is always rising. The way farmers know the river is always flooding. The way anyone who has ever loved something fragile knows that loss is not a possibility, but a schedule. The Leaning Tower of Pisa will fall someday. Not tomorrow, not next year, but someday. The stones will scatter, the marble will crack, the bells will ring one final time and then go silent forever. That day is coming. It is inevitable. The only question is when and who will be there to witness it, and whether anyone will bother to rebuild. But here's the thing about inevitable destruction. It makes the present moment precious. The tower leans today. You can see it today. You can climb its crooked stairs today. You can stand at the top and feel the Tuscan wind on your face and know that you are one of the lucky ones who got to experience this impossible thing before it became rubble and memory. That is not a sad thought. That is the opposite of sad. That is the definition of gratitude. Everything ends. Everything. The only variable is whether you were paying attention while it lasted. The Leaning Tower of Pisa has been paying attention for 800 years. It has watched empires rise and fall. It has watched science overturn religion. It has watched dictators come and go. It has watched tourists arrive in ever-increasing numbers, laughing and pointing and taking photographs that will outlive them all. And still it leans. Still it waits. Still it refuses to give gravity the satisfaction of a quick victory. That is not architecture. That is attitude. An attitude, unlike stone, is genuinely immortal. If you have made it this far, through the clay and the columns and the centuries of bad decisions that somehow produced something beautiful, you probably understand now why this story refuses to end cleanly. The Leaning Tower of Pisa does not offer closure. It offers continuation. It offers the quiet comfort of knowing that some problems are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be managed. They are meant to be lived with. They are meant to be loved despite their impossibility. That is the lesson hidden in the lean. Not that humans can fix everything. That humans can care about something broken for 800 years without ever giving up. That is not engineering. That is not physics. That is something raw, something more human than any straight line ever was. The tower leans, and somehow, so do we. All of us. Crooked, imperfect, still standing. Gravity, for now, has agreed to wait, but even gravity eventually gets tired. The tower is counting on that. So am I. So should you. There will be more stories like this, more magnificent failures, more accidents that became masterpieces, more moments when humanity looked at something broken and decided that broken was beautiful enough. The sun will rise tomorrow over Pisa. The bells will ring. The sensors will record their data. The engineers will drink their espresso and argue about millimeters. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the Piazza dei Miracoli, a tourist will look up at that white marble tower tilting against a blue sky, and they will feel something they cannot name. That feeling is the story. It always was. Sleep well, or stay curious, or both. The Leaning Tower will still be there whenever you return.